Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to do one of my very favorite videos of the entire year. Today I would like to tell you about the top 10 nonfiction books that I read in 2020. I'll give my yearly disclaimer that these are books that I personally read in 2020. They weren't necessarily published in 2020. However, by my count, it seems like 6 out of the total 10 books I'll be talking about in today's video were in fact published in 2020. I have ranked these books and I will be talking about them in reverse order. So I'll start off with the book that comes in at number 10 and slowly work my way up to talking about my favorite nonfiction book of the year. So my 10th favorite nonfiction book that I read this year is actually a 2019 release, Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson. This is a history of the islands of Polynesia and the peoples who natively inhabit them. The islands that make up Polynesia are pretty remotely located in the Pacific Ocean, so there's been this ongoing mystery, and one that sits at the center of this book, of how people originally found their way to these islands. The author did a ton of research for this book, and she highlights some really cool information that suggests how people may have come to these islands originally, and then how they were very easily able to navigate between these islands, which is fascinating stuff. But she also talks a lot about the different cultures of the peoples of Polynesia and how they interacted with the Europeans when they arrived. Even though the recorded history of Polynesia technically began when the Europeans arrived, she makes it very clear that she's not confusing that recorded history, which is largely made up of the impressions and opinions of the Europeans who found themselves on these islands, with the actual comprehensive history of these islands and their peoples. It would be impossible for any author out there to give us a 100% factually accurate history of these islands and how, where, when, and why people originally settled on them. But this author does a really good job of presenting us with everything we know right now. And she does so with an enormous amount of respect. You can just feel from reading this book how deeply this author cares. And I think that's what gives it its little bit of extra magic. You can feel how deeply she cares about this subject in the way that she presents everything and the way that everything is written. You wouldn't think that a book like this would be able to be described as heartfelt, but that is absolutely how I would characterize this book. And speaking of heartfelt, coming in at number 9 is How to Be a Good Creature, a memoir in 13 animals by Cy Montgomery. This is by the author of The Soul of an Octopus, which happens to be one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. This is an essay collection all about 13 different animals that came into this author's life at various points in her life. Some of them were brief encounters, while other ones were more long-term relationships, like pets that she had for years. In each one of these essays, Cy Montgomery tells the story of how she met the animal in question. She talks about what kind of a connection they shared. And she also discusses what her relationship with each animal taught her about the animal world or about life in general. I personally think that Cy Montgomery is incapable of writing anything that doesn't grab a hold of my heart and squeeze. She feels emotions so deeply, and she communicates them with her reader in such an eloquent way where you immediately feel this connection with her and with the animal that she's talking about. This is such a beautiful book. It's definitely heartbreaking at points, but I found it to be such a lovely reading experience. It's no surprise that it ended up on this list because of how much I love The Soul of an Octopus, but still, I am so glad I finally read this. In the 8th spot is another beautiful book, albeit a denser one. It's Fathoms, The World and the Whale by Rebecca Giggs. This book is so difficult to describe because there's so much going on within this book, but at its core, it's really about the links between the animal world and the human world. The author starts off this book by recalling an experience she had that really unsettled her. She saw a very large crowd of people gawking at a beached humpback whale in her hometown of Perth, Australia. She talks about this experience and she uses that as a jumping off point to start talking about whales in general. She talks about the whaling industry, which was very big for a very long time. And she also discusses how whales serve their underwater communities even in death. But beyond just discussing whales in their natural habitats, she goes on to discuss the interactions between whales and humans. She talks about how certain animals, like whales or even dolphins, have this natural charisma to them that makes us want to look out for their best interests. Hence, that's why there's a Save the Whales movement and not a Save the Sharks movement. She talks about how whales are affected by pollution in all different forms. But even though there's a lot of information in this book about whales, even though there is a whale on the cover, I would hesitate to call this book a work of natural history, and I wouldn't say that it's a book purely about whales. That's really not what the author was trying to achieve with this. This is much more a collection of discussions about the connections between the human world and the animal worlds, and the whale itself is kind of a symbol more than anything else. This is a very strange book to discuss. It's a very strange book to recommend to people, but I think the way that I recommend it actually speaks to what kind of a book this is. This is a book that I would actually recommend much more to lovers of intense, somewhat demanding literary fiction. I would recommend it to that kind of a reader before I would recommend it to someone who just loves books on animals. I'm somewhere in the middle of those two different styles of readers, so this really worked for me. It has some seriously gorgeous language in it. I have not been able to stop thinking about some of her points in this book, but there's so much in here that I absolutely need to reread it. Next, the number 7 spot belongs to The Story of More, How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Hope Jahren. This is by the author of Lab Girl, which is another one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books, so it's definitely not a surprise that this new one ended up on this list. This is a short book that Hope Jahren just released this year in 2020, and it's basically all about how much the world has changed between Hope Jaren's childhood in the 1970s and now, and how those changes are a direct result of human cravings to consume more, and some more on top of that. She talks in this book about just how much more we are consuming now than we did even 50 years ago. We're producing more food, consuming more energy, supporting more people, and the earth is paying the price. She discusses the ways in which the earth is responding to those increased pressures. She talks about what's projected to happen if things continue at their current pace, and who exactly is going to end up suffering the most because of those changes. But this isn't just a short doomsday kind of book. I wouldn't necessarily call the author's tone hopeful or optimistic, but she is very encouraging. She encourages her reader to keep the planet in mind when making choices of how to consume, which I think is a very important, very necessary first step in getting individual people involved in hopefully turning this around for us. I loved this book. I know that's partially because I already loved Hope Jahren. I love the way she writes. I love the way she makes me care so deeply about the things that she cares about. But I really loved how practical this book was. She gives a lot of suggestions of how you can play your own small part in turning all of this around. I have been keeping those suggestions in mind as I've made my own choices throughout the year. So beautiful plus practical. Pretty much a recipe to win me over. I actually did a full review of this book here on my channel. If you'd like to hear more about it, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. Now, number 6 on this list is an interesting one because it's The Salt Path by Rainer Winn. And when we were halfway through 2020, so in late June, early July, I made a video about my top books of the year so far. And at that point in the year, this was my favorite nonfiction book. I actually had every confidence that this book was going to end up being my favorite nonfiction book of the year, and now it's sitting at number 6, so not even in the top 5, if that gives you any kind of an idea of just how strong the top half of this list is. This is a memoir in which the author discusses a really difficult period of time in her life. Not only had she and her husband just lost their family's home where they raised their children as the result of a bad investment, but they also found out that her husband had just received what was likely going to be a terminal diagnosis. So since they no longer had housing, they no longer had really any direction for their lives, they decided they were going to start walking the Southwest Coast Path, which is the longest footpath in England. This is the story of their time spent walking the Southwest Coast Path and all of the day-to-day struggles that they faced. Obviously, they had money concerns. They had to worry day-to-day where they were going to be sleeping, how they were going to find food. It was a very stressful, but in certain ways, very freeing experience for them. Reading this book was such a powerful experience. The author and her husband were going through this horrific period of time in their lives, and she portrays it in such a raw and honest way that I really respect. This is a very popular memoir for a reason. All right, moving into the top half of this list, at number 5 is Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. This is another memoir, but written by a Korean-American woman who experienced postpartum psychosis. But this isn't a book that's just about the mental illness that she experienced, and nor is it just about her stay at the mental hospital, even though that's definitely a part of the story. Both of those things are a part of this story. But this book is also about the author's life leading up to becoming a mother and then having this experience. And while it may initially seem like that would be a distraction from the story that she's aiming to tell in this memoir, I actually argue that it's critically important to get to know who she was as a person, to get to know her background, get to know her, so that you can see the self that she lost when postpartum psychosis hit her when her son was only 3 months old. The way this author describes her backstory and then this dark downward spiral and then how she found her way out again, it is so difficult to describe just how intense this book is. I know people tend to throw around adjectives a lot when they describe books. I've been guilty of that myself sometimes, but this book is truly haunting. I cannot get it out of my head. In the 4th spot is Our Last Season, a writer, a fan, a friendship by Harvey Ayrton. This is another memoir, one about the author's career being a sports writer in New York City. He wrote for various venues over the years, but he eventually ended up at the New York Times. But also, this is a book about his decades-long friendship with a New York Knicks superfan. His friend Michelle loved the basketball team, the New York Knicks, like pretty much no one else. She was a very unlikely superfan. She was a busy professional. She ran her own business. She was the single mother of a brood of kids. And yet still, she found her way to pretty much every single Knicks home game. Her season tickets were actually directly behind the Knicks bench, and she was there all the time. So she heard all the dirt and she knew everyone to get even more dirt. So she started out as a source for the author's stories, but eventually these two became as close as family, and they shared one final season of basketball together before she died in 2018. So this book is a mixture of things. It's about Knicks basketball. There is quite a bit of information about Knicks basketball in here, but it's also the story of this author's career as a sports writer. It's the history of his friendship with Michelle, and it's about that final season of basketball that they got to share together. This book took me completely by surprise. I did not expect to love it as much as I ended up loving it. I was so invested in this book. I found it to be so touching. It got me super interested in Knicks basketball, which I knew next to nothing about when I was going into this book. I was thrilled that I got the opportunity to give this book a rave in the Christian Science Monitor. If you would like to read more about this book, I will link that review for you in the description box below. Moving into the very best of the best, at number 3 is Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. This is the latest biography of the author and poetess Sylvia Plath, who was a very complicated, very misunderstood woman who tragically took her own life at the young age of 30. This is not the first Sylvia Plath biography to ever be published, but what makes it unique is that this author spent 8 years researching this book. She had access to a lot of previously unpublished and some newly discovered materials, and also, because this author is a poetry professor, she decided to focus a lot of this book on the work of Sylvia Plath. The writing in this book is incredible, and it sucks you in so completely that I promise you, you will not even realize that this book is nearly 1,200 pages long. I read this book over a 4 to 5 day period around Thanksgiving, and I was completely immersed in this book. I felt like I was in Sylvia Plath's world. It was an intense week for me. This book is just amazing. It's definitely the best biography I have ever read, and I'm now feeling a whole new motivation to pick up biographies because of how much I loved this one. I actually did a full review of this book here on my channel. If you'd like to hear more about it, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. At number 2 is the one and only Svetlana Alexievich with her book, Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets. This is an oral history of the last generation of Soviet people, and in this book, the people who are included discuss their own personal backgrounds. They discuss what it was like living in the Soviet Union and now what it's like living in the former Soviet Union. It's pretty much impossible to summarize this book in any kind of cohesive way because all the different experiences described within it, they're all so unique, but then again, they're also devastating in their own ways. And I think that's really what's at the core of this book is just suffering and disappointment. The people who wanted to see the Soviet Union fall are now feeling disappointed that things have turned out the way that they have. And then the people who didn't want to see the Soviet Union fall are still heartbroken about it. This is definitely one of those books that you just have to experience for yourself. But if you do decide to read this one, you have to be ready for something very, very dark. This is a very intense book to read. It's devastating. I've never read anything else like this. I've never experienced anything else like this. And I even know a good bit about Russia and the former Soviet Union. But if you would like to hear me talk a little bit more about this book, I actually made a video fairly recently in which I discussed this book and 2 other books. One was about the Stalin era and another one's about modern Russia. I discuss all 3 books individually and then I talk about the connections that I saw between them. I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. And then finally, I am very excited to share my favorite nonfiction book of the entire year with you. It's Why Fish Don't Exist, A Story of Loss, Love, and the Hidden Order of Life by Lulu Miller. This is not the book that I expected would top this list, but I guess it's not all that surprising when you consider this book does share a lot of similarities with my all-time favorite nonfiction book, H is for Hawk. Both this book and H is for Hawk are these biography memoir combos that on the surface seem like they shouldn't work, but somehow they just do. The author of this book was dealing with the repercussions of a very careless and hurtful decision that she made when she became fascinated by the story of this taxonomist who was so determined to not let the universe thwart his efforts of classifying as many fish species as possible that he decided to sew the name tags for these specimens directly onto the specimens themselves. So he was sewing name tags onto dead fish bodies. This author decided to start researching this man, David Starr Jordan, partially because she was floundering and she needed a role model at the time, and this man's grit, his determination, was something that she really admired. But through her research, she began to learn more about him. She found out that he was quite possibly responsible for a murder. That whole situation is discussed in this book. And she also discovered that he was a big supporter of eugenics and forced sterilization. I was really enjoying this book the whole way through. I really thought it was going to end up being a 4-star read for me, which is still a very good rating. I liked the author's story. I liked hearing about her research into David Starr Jordan. I liked seeing how she put him up on a pedestal and how he got knocked down a few pegs because of everything that she discovered. But really, it wasn't until the final chapter that I realized how brilliant this book is. It's the chapter that brings everything together. It's the chapter that makes the title make sense. I don't want to talk too much about it, but it took my breath away. After reading that final chapter, and therefore experiencing this book as a whole, I now think this book is nearly perfectly executed. It is so concise. There is nothing in this book that doesn't need to be there, but it's also so beautiful. It encourages you to see the beauty in chaos, to learn to live in the entropy, to embrace your own helplessness, to take the good qualities that we see in others and mimic those, but also to look that person's deficiencies right in the eye and hopefully learn from their mistakes. This book is so well done. I loved it so much. I would say it's very likely a new all-time favorite. The next time I update that list, I imagine this book will be on there because wow. I actually made a review video discussing this book and Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs, which I discussed earlier in this video. I will link that review video for you in the description box below and up in the cards if you'd like to hear more about it. So those are my very favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2020. Once again, I had just a spectacular nonfiction reading year, and I really needed it this year. This year that was really hard. I know it was for all of us. I am so grateful that I had these books to provide light in an otherwise very dark time. If you have any comments or questions about any of these books, anything you've seen in this video, or about anything in general, please feel free to leave those in the comment section below. But if you would prefer to reach out to me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.